Well, hello and welcome to From the Deep End. Good to be with you. Of course, I'm Jonathan Jenkins. We are here Tuesdays and Thursdays, and we study our Bible together here on this program, show, whatever you want to call it. That's what we do. We're in the middle of a study of the book of Galatians. We'll be in Galatians chapter 4, down about verses 21 and 22 or so here in just a couple of moments. Just want to say hello to all the people. Starting to leave some comments in there. See you, Mercy and Jack and David and Holly and Shauna. Good to see you all here today. Looking forward to having a good discussion together as we open up our Bibles and do study. As you can see, if you're new viewer to the program, we do keep track of your comments. I try my best to pay attention to them as we go through the class. So any thoughts, any questions, whatever's on your mind, go ahead and put that in. I'll do my best to take note of them and reply to them as needed throughout the course of this next couple hours. So anyway, I think that's about it. I'm just trying to think if we had anything we wanted to catch up to speed with. I probably should do that before I turn on the camera, shouldn't I? That'd be a really good thing to work through my brain and think about before we turn the camera on. I don't think there's anything. So with that being said, let's go ahead and turn our attention over to the book of Galatians. So there we are. All right, we are in, as I said, chapter 4. Down there about verse 21 is where we started up on Thursday of last week. And I left us off in a place Thursday that I want to get to relatively soon here. We are looking at this phrase that's highlighted here in the brown text. The phrase here, according to the flesh. All right. I can't go back over all the material because that took 2 hours that we talked about Thursday as we introduced this section. But for those who may not have seen Thursday, and to try and keep this thing usable in a single broadcast, give me just a couple minutes here just to summarize everything we talked about. Okay. What we were talking about in that setting was Paul's use, and let me scroll down here a little farther where you can see it. Paul's use, well, within this context, and then more broadly throughout all of his writings, of what he means by according to the flesh and according to the Spirit. Now, we are still dealing with his use of the phrase according to the flesh, and that is a topic that we have already covered in previous shows at some length. And yes, we're doing it here again. We did it on Thursday, and we're about to do it here again today because it is such a baked in portion of the, again, now I got to say the recipe of Christian theology, what flesh means. Okay. And in nearly every major doctrinal construct, we did talk about this some Thursday, be it original sinful, depraved, the sin nature, as some people call it. Okay. That's just what, that's the nature, that's the nature of it. That's what we do with it. Okay. And that is not Paul's usage of the term. It's simply not. Okay. Being born according to the flesh here, and this is where we spent most of our time on last Thursday, is not being born according to some depraved nature. Okay. The context in which that is found, and again, go back and watch Thursday's show, starts in Genesis 15. Ishmael, through Hagar, is born according to the flesh. The context starts after Abraham has been in the promised land now for about a decade. He still does not have an heir that God had promised. He says, God, let me help you here. Do it through Eliezer. God says, nope, not going to be through Eliezer. I'm going to bring you a son. And there's where Abraham's faith is first credited for being righteousness. Now, that is not fulfilled until Genesis 22. That's what the text says, James chapter 2. Okay. However, before that happens, Abraham is trying to get an heir through Eliezer, or let Eliezer be the heir. Okay? At the end of chapter 15, start of 16, Sarai, we call her Sarah, joins in the party. She says, the Lord has prevented me from bearing a child. The Lord who has promised us to have a child. We're going to get an heir from me through Hagar. Now you need to understand the culture a little bit. Sarah, that Sarah didn't just make up something there. That would have counted. That's part of the culture. Okay. And that's the path we're going to go down. Of course, that doesn't work out too. I mean, Ishmael is born, but Sarai gets grumpy about the whole situation because Hagar, looked, according to Sarah, looked with contempt upon her mistress. Okay. Sarah wasn't real happy about Hagar having a baby, and whether Hagar did it or not, Sarah interpreted it that way, and that's the path it goes. Point being, though, this is not Abraham getting sweet on Hagar and convincing Sarah that he needs to have another woman. This is not depravity. Okay. This is Sarah acknowledging the Lord has prevented her. Okay. This is not any form of depravity, sensuality, licentiousness at all that causes Ishmael to be born. It's trying to help God out. And that's to be done according to the flesh. Now, that's about where we ended in that portion of the discussion. Okay. So go back and watch last Thursday's if you need more detail on that, because we spent a lot of time on it, but I need to move on. But back over here in Galatians 4, that is again stated to be a birth, which is to be done according to the flesh. Okay. Now, we just about completely left off the program last week. We were in Paul's use of that terminology as is introduced in Galatians. Galatians 2:20. The life that I now live in the flesh. Catch that word now. It's important. The life that I now live in the flesh. Well, when you read the word now, you're going to have to ask, if you're a diligent, disciplined Bible student, the very next question you need to be asking yourself is, what would be the other option here? Okay. If I'm doing it now by the flesh, what was I doing before? Well, Paul was still living in the flesh. Not going to go over there just yet, but we did that Thursday in our close. I think we did, if I remember correctly. We went back over to Romans chapter 6, Romans chapter 7, Romans chapter 8, where Paul makes that contrast. We were living in the flesh, and now he says we're not living in the flesh, but here he says I am still living in the flesh. I now live in the flesh. This is not depravity. You can't both be in and out of the flesh if it's a state of depravity. Can't be. That's not the way that works. Okay, even most versions of Calvinistic doctrine I've ever read across doesn't do that. You have the imputed righteousness of Christ. You are cloaked in his righteousness. As we sing in that song we sing, we are dressed in his righteousness alone. Okay, what that means is inwardly we're still corrupted and depraved and so on. We're just being cloaked by the righteousness of Jesus. So God sees righteousness while in fact we are still depraved. Okay, that's the basis of standard Calvinistic theology as I've seen it taught, heard it taught. Okay. So you can't have both. You can't both be in and out of the flesh. But yet Paul in Romans 7 says, when we were in the flesh, and in Romans 8 he says, if the Spirit of God is in you, you are no longer in the flesh, but in the Spirit. But he now says in Galatians 2, verse 20, I now live in the flesh. How's that possible? Well, let me keep going. This is where we wrapped up. Okay. Chapter 3, verse 4. No, 3, verse 3, excuse me. Having begun in the Spirit, are you now being made perfect by the flesh? That's what they were after. They were trying to, by the flesh, be made perfect. All right? And so, what is the origin of that? How did they think they could be made perfect by the flesh? Do you think did they think they could be made perfect by their depravity, by their original sin, by their sinful nature? No, that's not what they thought. That's not what they were being taught. What they were being taught was down here at the end of Galatians 4, which eventually we will get to. They were being taught that according to the flesh, because we are dealing here with two covenants. We'll talk about that at length when we get down to verse 24. We're dealing here with two covenants, right? One manifestation here is according to the flesh, one is according to the Spirit. What were they trying to do? Well, they were accepting circumcision. That was the basis of it. The doctrine that the Galatians were following was the doctrine of circumcision, right? And so in chapter 6, as Paul wraps up this discussion, he says to them, what you are doing now is you are sowing to your own flesh. Now you will from that reap corruption. That's the whole point. That's the whole point of Galatians. That's the whole point of Romans. But you are not sowing to the flesh in order to have a more enjoyable life. That's not what's going on. They weren't trying to go out and live as the works of the flesh are described as being sexually immoral, impure, sensual, idolatrous, sorceress, I guess, having enmity or hatred. That's not where they were trying to go. No, what they were trying to do by accepting circumcision and following that, again, frankly, the obligation of keeping the whole law, what they were trying to do, Galatians chapter 3, was they were trying to be made perfect by the flesh. They were trying to make things better, not worse. They were trying to make things better. Okay, just like Sarah. Sarah, the Lord has prevented me from having a child. Here's what we're going to do to make it better. Abraham, I'm going to give you a child in my name through my handmaiden, Hagar. Okay, that made physical, cultural, in that context, even moral sense to Sarah. That was not sinful. That was not depraved. She wasn't trying to create what we would call a polyamorous relationship. She wasn't trying to create what we might call an open relationship, open marriage. No. Hagar belonged to Sarah. Okay, she was her slave. Anything that Hagar produced belonged to Sarah. Ishmael should have belonged to Sarah. Okay, that's the path. This is not depravity. This is Sarah saying, the Lord has prevented me. I'll help out. Just like Abraham was trying to do with Eliezer, Sarah was trying to do with Hagar. They were trying to help God out. Now, actually, where we frankly dead left off, okay, was on Thursday, was just this, right? This doctrine of accepting circumcision. That's the initial step of the false gospel, Galatians 1, that has worked its way into Galatia. The first tenet of that doctrine is that you need to accept circumcision. That is the beginning point, but it also includes the obligation to keep the whole law. All right. That's the beginning point. Where did that originate from? Well, obviously it's Jewish. It began circumcision. Obviously that begins with Abraham, Genesis 17, but that's to bring that to a Gentile church. That would be the Judaizers who are bringing that in. Okay. Where did the Judaizers come from? All right. Well, I've covered this, I don't know how many times. You should know the verse by now because we've referenced the verse often. The verse that you need is Acts 15, verse 5, because the doctrine that began not long after technically begins with the circumcision party back in Acts 11, but dealing directly with the Gentiles begins, or the Gentiles converted through the apostolic work of Paul, begins here in Acts 15. Some people show up in Antioch, and they're teaching you have to be circumcised in order and keep the customs of Moses. There's your obligation to keep the whole law. You have to be saved. In order to be saved, you have to do that. You have to be made perfect by your flesh. That's the doctrine. What's the origin of that? The origin of that doctrine is that some believers, so these are Christians, they belonged to the party of the Pharisees. So the doctrine, the origin point of Calvinistic doctrine in, not Calvinistic, well, it's Calvinistic doctrine, but the origin of Judaizing doctrine in the early church came out of the Jewish traditions of the Pharisees. All right, hang with me. The other text that we have used over and over again in trying to examine this is that the Pharisees, what did they hold dear? Well, they claimed to hold the law of Moses dear, to the point that Jesus says about them in Matthew chapter 23 that they sit in the seat of Moses. That's in the opening, 2 or 3 verses of 23? They sit in the seat of Moses. But what did they hold even more dear? What they actually held dear, as we have highlighted here over and again, the tradition of the elders, the tradition of the elders, the tradition of the elders, they held those in such high honor that they have left the commandments of God, and they are holding on to these traditions of men to the point that they are now the commandments. They are the commandments of men, and they end up rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish their own tradition. Okay? So, even more fully here, we haven't spent a lot of time here, but I want to show it to you. Moses says, honor your father and mother, and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die. Okay? Here's what the Pharisees did. They say, if a man tells his father or mother, whatever you have gained from me is Corban, that is, given to God. Okay, then you no longer permit him to do anything for his mother or father, thus making void the word of God by your traditions that you have handed down. Okay, let's get the marginal right there. Okay, it's an offering to God. So basically, there were 2 laws that had to take place from the law of Moses. Okay, one, you had to give tithes. Okay, there was not just a tithe, by the way. There was about 3 different tithes minimum, and then free will offerings as well. But there were tithes that had to be given, and you had to honor your father and your mother. Okay, so here's what the tradition of men did. Is there was apparently not for them enough specificity within the law of Moses, so they came up and said, well, here it is. If it is, as translated in the ESV, if it is Corban, if it's an offering to God, once it's committed over there, even perhaps even if it's not given fully, but once it's committed, you can't give it to mother and father. All right, so they created a structure and a system to answer all the questions. All right, now we could get into the depravity of their mind that caused that to happen. But notice what they did. All right. And the same thing's going on up here. This one we looked at. All right. What they did was they created additional parameters that helped what they believed to be the proper application of God's law. And that's what they did down here. Now, we can argue again whether or not that was entirely well-meaning at the beginning, but there it is. Okay, we got these 2 laws. We got to harmonize them. Here's how we're going to do it. And so they created their own law, which then, of course, men used to their own benefit. Because I would suspect, and you have to find somebody who knows more about the history of this than I do, I would suspect that was probably created trying to actually answer a legitimate question. And once it was created, guess what man did? Okay? Because once you made it as an offering to God, it's gone, and I can't give it to my mother and father, but I have to make offerings to God So what do I do? And so probably, and I do not know the history on this. Somebody look it up for me if you want to. Probably somebody went down to a rabbi, went down to a priest and asked, "Hey, which one do I do?" And so an actual answer given. All right. And then somebody looked at the actual answer that was given and went, "You know what? If I promise that offering, and of course all you need now is some kind of priest. Let's say I'm going to give you $1,000, but what you're going to do once I give you the $1,000 is you're going to pay me interest back on it or something of that nature. Or maybe I promise you $1,000 and I pay the interest to the temple from the investment that I've made. And since that money is already set aside, even though I might still have possession of it, I can't give it over there, which means I get to make my offering and still somehow keep my own money." See, that's what we would do with it. We would come up with some kind of system like that to kind of bypass. That's what we would do with it. Wouldn't surprise me at all if the initial answer to that was probably well-meaning, trying to help God out. Okay, even when Jesus overturns the moneymakers in the temple. Now, those money makers in the temple, they weren't giving you the best exchange rates. It's like when you buy a Coke at Disney. If you go to a Disney theme park and you stop at a vending machine or you stop at a counter to get a Coke, it's going to cost you about $17. Okay, that's just the way you do it. You create that exclusive environment, and now that exclusive environment is created. Now that it's there, you can charge what you want to, and that's probably what the moneymaker changers were doing. But the basis of the money changers was legitimate, because if a man was coming in from too far away, he had to take his animals, and then he could sell the animals, bring cash. He'd show up at the temple and then buy an animal. That was part of the law. Okay, he could do that. He could bring cash instead of his offering if the travel was too far for the animal. That was allowed. But lo and behold, guess what happened? We created a system. We created rules and regulations. And it takes about 6 minutes for somebody to say, if I just charge a 10% administrative fee, what's the harm there? Okay. And then 10% becomes like the federal income tax. Used to be, when it first started, it was like 1 or 2%, right? And it ain't 1 or 2% anymore. Because that's what happens. Okay. Because that's what humans do. Hold on to that. We're coming back to it. But they did the same thing up here in the verses we have been looking at. Okay. God said, do not eat if you're defiled. Okay. If you're defiled, if you're unclean, certain limitations on what you do. Here the Pharisees come along, and the traditions of the elders, that rabbinical lore. Okay. Man, we're going to do our cups and our pots and our copper vessels and our dining couches. Anytime you walk into the marketplace, you're going to wash your hands, to the point then that if anybody violates the traditions of the elders, we're going to come and we're going to call you out. Okay. Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands? Okay. Let me ask you this. Would Jesus actually have let his disciples in his presence eat of hands that were actually defiled? I guess no. Jesus was pretty fond of making sure people kept God's laws. If the disciples were actually doing something that violated in his presence the law of Moses, pretty confident. I'm going to go out on a limb here. I'm pretty confident Jesus would have said, nope, can't do that. Could you eat with defiled hands under the Old Testament law? Could you do those things? I mean, there's all kind of restrictions for someone who is defiled, somebody who's unclean. But the Pharisees, with all of their go to the marketplace, all their pots and the dining couches, all that stuff, they counted those hands as defiled. Okay? That is the background. That's the reason I paused here to go over this for a few minutes. That is the background of what is being taught by these Pharisees who are now part of the church. These Pharisees who are now part of the church that are saying you have to be circumcised according to the custom of Moses. The tradition of the elders back in Mark 7. Okay. It is those Pharisees that are telling people that they need to accept circumcision here in Galatians 5. And part of the reason that you need to accept circumcision is so that you will continue to sow to your flesh. You will continue to make the flesh better. It will get better and better and better to the point then that you are being made perfect by the flesh. And so Paul says, I am now living in the flesh. Okay? There you go. Notice what the Pharisees are doing. Now, when all of this begins, what are they trying to do? When all of this begins, they're trying to make God's law better. All of this rabbinical lore, all of the traditions of the fathers. Again, they weren't created out of depravity. They weren't saying, "Oh, you need to wash that pot. You need to." They weren't doing all of that because they were trying to get away with stuff. They were creating all kind of other qualifications, all kind of other parameters by which you would ensure that you didn't violate all of God's laws. Okay? It's just like you do when you're a parent and you got kids coming in the house and so on and so forth. You start telling kids, you got to, I don't know, wash your hands here and there. You got to brush your teeth here and there. You create all of these rules and regulations. That's I was it's just funny. It just I've got a few grandchildren now, and the I hear my son-in-law daughter talking to their kid, the youngest one, every time the youngest one comes out of the bathroom. Okay, it's getting better now. It doesn't have to happen all the time now, but you've been through it. You got a young child just recently been potty trained. They come out of the bathroom. What do you ask them first? Did you flush? Because often they don't. They forget to flush it. And second question, what's the second question? Did you wash your hands? What's the third question? Did you use soap? Fourth question, did you dry your hands? See, that's what you do. That's what you do with a young child like that. Because you can't trust. You can't just say you need to go to the restroom. You can't just say that. Because all of the things that go along with it. And so you create all of these rules and regulations on a young child. Now, the problem with that is it's not hard to turn that into law. To turn that into law. And we do that all over the place. All right. Now, we left off that, by the way, that's the 30 minutes of 2 hours Thursday. All right. Now, where I left you off on Thursday was this question. Where is the first place anywhere in the Bible where effectively this party of the Pharisees rose up? Now, I'm not asking that in a literal sense, because in a literal sense, your first place the Pharisees you're going to find the Pharisees by name. It's going to be in the New Testament. But by spirit, by practice, by having the traditions of the fathers. Where's the first place it ever happens? What are they doing? There's a law. Okay, wash your hands. Honor your father and mother, but also do tithes. There's a law. Their response to that law, let's give them credit for trying to do the right thing to start. Okay. Where did all of these traditions about you got to wash every pot, whether you got to wash every time you go to where did this happen? Because somebody ate with defiled hands that were actually defiled because they didn't realize. And so lo and behold, when the 5-year-old came out of the bathroom, they started asking every single time, did you wash your hands? Did you wash your hands? Did you wash your hands? And it got so cumbersome doing that they created rules. Instead of having to ask every single time about this, what we're going to do is we're just going to wash our hands every single time we do anything. Okay? And so that which was a practice became a law. Where did that happen? Did that start with first century Pharisees? No. All of that rabbinical lore, because you have both the law, you have both the Torah, and then you have all of the rabbinical traditions, all of the rabbinical writings that go along with the Torah. Okay? The Mishnah, I believe they call it, right? That predates the Pharisees of Jesus' time. In fact, that's what they call it, the traditions of the elders. So it predates early Pharisees, first century Pharisees. Where does it start? I need you to get this. I need you to stop and think, because this is, focus for a minute with me. The whole point we're making here is that this over here in Galatians 4, that this is done according to the flesh. It is not about depravity. Doing something according to the flesh is about trying to make sure the flesh is perfect. Abraham, I can't have a child. Do it through Eliezer. Sarah, I can't have a child. Do it through Sarah. Do it through Hagar. It's all the same thought according to the flesh. Where does it start? Okay. Since this is about making God's law better on some level, we can't start it prior to God having a law, can we? So the first possible point in human history where this Pharisaical approach to the laws of God, where you create the tradition of the elders, could not possibly start before God gives a law. All right? Right. Couldn't start before then. So it has to start no earlier than that. All right, so let's look at that first law. The first law that God gives. Okay? Got it underlined right here for you. Okay? You may eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. All right? Now, at this point, is Abraham depraved? You believe in the doctrine of depravity? You believe in the doctrine of original sin, whatever version of it you have. If you're a member of the Church of Christ who believes in some version of a darkening of the heart by practice and so on and so forth, is there any possibility that that is true? Any version of that, wherever you are on the spectrum of a fallen human nature, is there any version of that that can be true at this point? Every single person has to answer that question no. If you answer that question yes, you got a big problem. Because you have a fallen, depraved nature that God said is, I need to go back up earlier, that God said was very good. Okay, the end of chapter 1 there. Very good. Very good. There is no possibility, not even 0.001% chance, that any form of the depravity that comes from sin, the original sin, the fallen nature, whatever you make of it, it simply does not exist. Which, by the way, great question. Eric Owens was the first one I ever heard ask this question, and it has been one I have used over and over again. dealing with this whole doctrine, which is, how did they sin then? How did they sin? Because if they're made in the image of God and so forth, how did they sin? If they're wholly depraved after they sin and they can't do good, then were they 7% depraved before that? That's the question. And the answer is they were 0%. Okay, if 100% depraved can't do good, how does 100% made in the image of God do bad? See, there is a philosophical problem there. The equation doesn't work. Okay, that's off topic, but that's a great topic. Point being, though, the depraved nature, whatever you make of it, the fleshly nature. Let's just go with that language since that's what we're talking about. The fleshly nature does not exist. If fleshly nature is tied to sinful nature, sin nature, depravity, whatever it is, it does not yet exist. Okay, why is that important? It does not exist in Adam. Does it exist in Eve? No, because she hadn't sinned either. Bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. She hadn't sinned either. Okay? Satan comes to the woman and asks, did God actually say, you shall not eat of any tree in the garden? And the woman said to this person, yeah, well, no, he didn't say that. We may eat of the trees in the garden. But God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that's in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die. Okay, so there's a repetition of God's law. All right, she gets the first part. Now, notice what Satan does here. He goes with the broader one first. Did he actually say that? No, he didn't say that. What he said was, we may not eat it. We may eat of the trees in the garden. Did he say that? Did God actually say that? Well, yeah, because you can just go right back up here. You may surely eat of every tree of the garden. Yeah, that's exactly what he said. Okay, great. But God said, you may not eat of the fruit tree that is in the midst of the garden. Did he say that one? Yeah, he said that one. But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall not eat. So there it is. God said, you shall not eat of the fruit tree that is in the midst of the garden. He said that. You see what's highlighted on the screen there? Highlighted right there. I leave that highlighted in my biblical text because I think it is one of the most important phrases in terms of dealing with how you understand your Bible. I think that is one of the most important phrases you will ever come across in your Bible. And we skim right past it. Neither shall you touch it. But God said, you shall not eat, neither shall you touch it. There it is. There's what God said. Can you find me something? Can you find me the you shall not, neither shall you touch it? Can you find that for me? Can you find me the neither shall you touch it phrase? Nope. It does not exist. As far as we have biblical record, God never said that. Okay? In fact, God put the garden there and put man in it. And guess what man was supposed to do that he was being put in it? He was to work it and he was to keep it. It's a garden. Got to be worked. Got to be taken care of. I wonder if the tree of the knowledge of good and evil ever needed to be trimmed. I wonder if they had been there long enough, if ever its fruit would have fallen like fruit does from a tree, fallen to the ground, and maybe it needs to be cleaned up. I wonder, in order to work and to keep the garden, if at some point Adam and Eve might have actually touched the tree or maybe touched its fruit. Okay. Help me here. God did not say, at least as we have biblical record, and if you're going to create a doctrine, you can't go beyond what we have record of. God did not say that. Why did Eve say this? There are only four people or four beings in play here. Okay, at this point in existence, there are only four beings in play. There's God, there's Satan, there's Eve, because she's the one actually doing the talking, and then there's Adam. At this point, there are four beings in play. Verse 17 of chapter 2, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. How many beings are in play right there? Well, in terms of your biblical record, there God is there, obviously. Adam is there. In terms of the biblical record, Satan is not there yet. Guess who else is not there? Then, after this, then the Lord said, it is not good the man should be alone. I will make a helper fit for him. Oh, Eve is not there. When this is said, Adam is the only person in existence. Well, Satan existed, but Adam is the only person in existence. Adam. Where did Eve hear that from? Only two possibilities. Satan didn't say it to her. There's only two possibilities. The first one would be God. That'd be your first option. If God said it, I got a question. If this is actually what God said, if this is the fullness of the law that maybe was repeated after God creates Eve, he comes back and he tells Adam and Eve together, here's the law. Could you tell me what changed? Could you tell me what changed that he did not say it here, and then without record, he repeats it to Eve? It's possible, but I'd like some explanation on it. I got another option here. The Lord commanded the man, Adam. I wonder if Adam said that to Eve. Is it possible Adam said that to Eve? If it is, guess what we just included? Guess what we just found? Because here's what Adam would have done. God said to Adam, "You shall not eat of it." Eve said, "We shall not eat. Now we shall not touch it." So either she made that up herself, which is possible, or Adam gave it to her, which is certainly possible. God didn't say it. As far as we have record, God did not say that. The fact that Eve said that God said it means either she's wrong or that was added into the equation. Guess what we just found here, if that is? Whether it comes from Adam or whether it comes from Eve, guess what we just found? We just found the first Pharisees. The very first Pharisees entered the world, unless God said something we don't have record of. The very first Pharisees entered the world with the very first law of God. And I want you to notice what they did. They added to God's law, and they restricted the use of flesh. God said to them under the law of Moses, "Don't eat with defiled hands." The Pharisees said, "We're going to make sure we don't," or the rabbis said, "We're going to make sure we don't. And what we're going to do is we're going to wash every time we go to every pot, every dining couch. We're going to make, and to the point then that if you violate even our tradition, we're going to say that you are eating with defiled hands, even though the actual law doesn't say your hands are defiled. We're going to create all of the traditions of the elders. The traditions of the elders, we're going to elevate those to commandments, and we're going to make sure that we hold fast to our tradition. And if you violate our tradition, we're going to call you out on it. Because your hands, not just that you're violating the traditions, your hands have now actually become defiled. I wonder, and I cannot prove this definitively, I just wonder if Adam looked at his new lovely bride and said to her, "God said we can't eat this fruit, and we're not even going to touch it." And they said it so heartily and so firmly that it came down to the point that that which we were doing to protect ourselves, to make sure that our flesh remained perfect, we're now just going to flat out say God said it, because we don't do that at all today. Because we would never have any rules or regulations like at a church where you deal with exactly the clothing that's supposed to be worn. Or I remember when I was first training to be a preacher, we actually would have conversations, actual conversations about whether or not a preacher could have a beard or a mustache. Because we don't do that at all now. We absolutely never create our own traditions and so on to the point, and then over time, they become rules and regulations that are tied to the text. We don't do that. Oh, wait. Unless I'm flat wrong here, the very first time humanity encountered God's law, guess what they did? Because you don't want to touch it. Because if you go over there and you touch it, now you've got the fruit in your hand. And guess what you might do with a piece of fruit that's in your hand? Well, if my fingers can touch it, maybe I can just put it up here and sniff it. Maybe I can smell it. But now it's just right there. Maybe I can just kind of lick it. I can just put my lips against it, put the tip of my tongue on it. I'm not actually eating it. So to make sure we don't fall into that trap, here's what we're going to do. We're not even going to touch it. To the point that now we're going to say that God said, don't touch it. Now, there's an inherent problem with this. The inherent problem is you just made God's law harder. And since I'm supposed to work and to keep the garden, now I potentially have dead fruit over here that's rotting away and it needs to be cleaned up in our garden, which is supposed to be clean. And it's our job to keep it clean. There's another problem, though. The second phrase I have highlighted here. She took of its fruit. So either within her own mind or from Adam or some record we don't have record of. But in her mind, God said, don't touch. And then she did touch. I wonder how long? How long between the touch and the bite? Because if what you've heard is God said, don't touch it, lest you die. And I walk over there and I pick one up, pull it off the tree. I'm now touching it. Do you start looking around? What do you do? Let me back up to the actual point that we're making here. I got a couple of comments I need to get to. I'll get them in a minute. But let me back up to the actual point that I'm making here. Where is the depraved nature at this point? The depraved nature can start no earlier than right here. Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. After Eve eats. And really, we need to get down to verse 7, into verse 6, where it says, and Adam ate. That's where the depraved nature can come in. So you got one of two options. Either God said that and she's dead flat right, and we're just not told about it in chapter 2. Or some version of humanity, be it Adam or be it Eve, created greater specificity to God's law to ensure that no violation happened. And lo and behold, it failed. Some version of that. Both of those precede sinful nature. Let's just assume for a minute that my take on this is right. Let's just assume for a minute it could be right. What would you call this? If this is the first commandment given, and perhaps within days, minutes, in my brain at least, here's Eve created. Adam says, yep, you did a good job there, God. I like me that one. This is now bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, and so on. And they were walking around naked and they were not ashamed. Ta-da! Yay. I wonder how long. How long before Adam turned to Eve and said, oh, listen, sweetie, there's one thing you need to know. Really, one important thing you need to know here. Don't eat of that tree. In fact, we're not even going to touch that tree. I wonder how long that conversation took to take place. I'm going to guess not long. Because Eve's there. You don't want her just walking over the tree and eating and she doesn't know. So unless God told her himself, Adam had to do that. And I'm guessing it didn't take long. What do you call that? Because it seems to be native. Let's just assume for a moment That the commandment God gave is actually what the Bible text says. And when I say let's assume for a moment, this is the actual record of what God said. What words would you use to describe a non-depraved, non-sinful, made in the image of God being who immediately adds a requirement to God's law? What would you call the impetus for that? Okay, it's something that is obviously baked into the cake. Somehow it's there. What do you call that? It's not sinful. It's not depraved. What do you call it? Can you turn through the rest of your Bible and maybe possibly come up with another phrase that might describe something that is native to the human nature, not connected to depravity, because depravity does not yet exist? What would you call it? In the rest of your Bible, can you come across what's going on here? Remember, we're talking about according to the flesh. Are Adam and Eve made out of flesh? Well, yeah, they've got bodies, walking around naked, bodies. Undepraved, they have flesh and spirit at this point. They've been made out of dirt, the flesh, and then the rib, obviously, and God has breathed into them the breath of life. Flesh and spirit, they have them both. But not depraved. Does that topic ever come up ever again? They want to make sure the flesh doesn't even touch what God said don't eat. Can you come up with any Bible passage where maybe there's some people that are walking around saying, do not handle, do not taste, do not touch? Sound familiar? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. You know what? If you do mess up and you touch it, or if at least there's even a possibility that you have touched it, man, you'd better not even come out of the marketplace unless you wash. Very first time God gives a law, as far as we have record, man added to it to the point that said, don't even touch it. In the days of Jesus, the Pharisees had come along and said, listen, we got to make sure you haven't just messed up and touched something you weren't supposed to touch. And if you did touch it, you got to wash now. And you got to wash anything that you might end up touching. You might touch that cup. You might touch that pot or that vessel. Or you might sit down on that couch and somebody else was unclean on that couch. Before you ever do touch it, you need to make sure that you wash it so that it's clean. So don't handle, do not taste, do not touch. Because 30 years after this, when Paul writes, the book of Colossians, he says to them, you're submitting to regulations that say do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. Same thing. And here he says, these are according to human precepts and teachings. You know what those human precepts and teachings are there for? Those human precepts and teachings are there, which are, by the way, do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. What are they there for? Well, they are there because they look smart. They have an appearance of wisdom. They look really, really smart. That's why we make them. I wonder if in Adam's brain, let's blame Adam here. Again, I can't prove this directly, but it's either God or Adam. Got to be one or the other. I wonder if Adam's brain if he came to the thought, God said don't eat it. You know what would be even better? Since he said don't eat it, what's going to be even better is if we don't touch it. Because that sounds a whole lot like a group of Pharisees saying, we can't touch that pot. It might be unclean, so we need to make sure it's washed before we touch it. It has an appearance of, it sounds a lot smarter, right up until Eve touches the fruit and doesn't die. Okay, but it sounds a lot smarter. And why is it so important? Because here's what we're trying to do. We are trying to stop the indulgence of the flesh. Because if you're in the garden and you touch it, you might sniff it. And if you sniff it, you might press it against your lips. Because if you touch it and you handle it, you might sniff it and just press it against your lips or maybe the tip of your tongue, and you get a feel of the taste of it. But Adam said, don't touch it. And Eve still ate it. Did Adam solve anything? Did Adam fix the potential problem? Nope. You know why? Because do not handle, do not taste, do not touch are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. Because when Eve saw it, it was good for the eyes. It's good for food. It was able to make one wise. So she took of the fruit and she ate it. Telling the flesh, do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, is of no value in stopping the indulgences of the flesh. You see, that's what Jesus said about the Pharisees. Back over here in Matthew chapter 23, these Pharisees, these scribes and these Pharisees that sit on the seat of Moses, whenever they tell you something, frankly, about the works of the law, about the law, do that. Yeah, do that. But not the works they do. Why? For they preach, but they do not practice. Because why? Because they say do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. What they say is, if you're at the marketplace, you got to wash when you come out. If you got a pot and a pan and a vessel and you got a seat you're going to sit on, all those have to be washed before you sit down. They give you all of these rules. But what they do is they tie up heavy burdens that are hard to bear. Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, that God never actually said. They do all of that and they lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves, they don't do anything because they don't actually do it. Why? Because when you sow to the flesh, because that's what you're doing here, you're trying to tell the flesh, don't do, you're putting these burdens, you're sowing to the flesh, you're putting these burdens on people, trying to carry them around, all these extra rules, so that the Jesus' disciples, when they walk into the marketplace or whatever, they've got to think about, oh man, did I wash my hands right? Did. Because that's what you're doing. When you do that, when you sow to the flesh, guess what? When you sow to the flesh, you will from the flesh reap corruption. Why? Because it fails. Why does it fail? Because all of these human regulations, guess what they are? He says they are of no value in stopping the flesh from the indulgences of the flesh. But I ask a question. Can you come up with a phrase? If Adam and Eve did that, if the very response of mankind, if Adam's response, the very first time he has to repeat that law, God said this, he repeats it to Eve, and Eve now hears God said don't touch, when God didn't actually say that as far as we have record of. Man's very first response was to add his human precepts and his teachings. His very first response was to add a do not touch onto the law. Could you come up with a Bible phrase that maybe would describe what's going on here? How about this one? You see, it is an elemental spirit or principle, depending on your translation. It's elemental. Elemental. What's that mean? It's an element. What's an element? Scientifically, what's an element? See, water is not it's not an element. The water molecule is H2O. 2 hydrogen atoms, 1 oxygen atom. You apply the right charge to that molecule, guess what you can do? You can break it down into, well, H and O2, hydrogen and oxygen. That's what you can break it down to. Now, help me here. What happens if you try to break down hydrogen? If you try to break a hydrogen atom apart, is what happens out of that good or bad? We do have a name for it. Way back when, we just simply referred to it as a hydrogen bomb. And we've blown up a couple of them. Actually, more than a couple of them, but we've blown some up. Now, if you take oxygen, O2, because it does bind up, and you eliminate that, if you break that apart, is that good or bad? It has about the same effect, maybe not as big, but it has about the same effect as when you take a hydrogen atom and you break it apart. Boom. Boom. If it's an element, you can't eliminate it. You can't break it down. That is its smallest operative element in the universe, in the world. It doesn't get any smaller than that. It's an element. Do you see the point yet? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch precedes depravity. Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch happens before depravity. Can't be connected to sinful nature. Can't be connected to the indulgence of the sinful flesh. Nope. It precedes it. Why? Because it is an elemental part of the world, of human existence. It's the same thing he said about that in verse 8. It is an elemental spirit of the world. It's according to human tradition because it's the elemental principle of the world. It is the elemental principle, Galatians 4, of the world. It is the elemental principle of the world, Galatians 4. Why? We talked about it at great length. Strangely enough, the elemental principle of the world enslaved Jews under the law. And the elemental principle of the world enslaved Gentiles under idols. Do you know who the first person enslaved by the elemental principle of the world was? Eve. Because unless God did it, there's only one other person who could have done it. Eve did not exist when God's law was said. So either he did not fully tell Adam, which is dangerous, because if he meant touch, if Adam, if you touch that fruit, I'm going to kill you, he should have said it. He didn't say it. He told Adam, don't eat. He didn't say nothing about touching. Eve was told not to touch, which is based upon human principles that have an appearance of wisdom that Paul calls an elemental principle of the world. That's what we do. That's what the rabbis did. That's what the Greek teachers of idolatry, that's what they did. And we talked about this at length. We still do it today. When we talked about it at length, I forget several shows ago, but I talked about HOAs. I just bought a house a couple weeks ago. Made my first mortgage payment. Sent it in last night. Yay! Only 359 more to go. I guess that is. No HOA though. You move into a neighborhood with HOAs. It's not like they're never going to make any more rules. It's not like as soon as that deed restriction is made way back when that you're done. No. You may get grandfathered in if you're so fortunate to buy way back when. But if you buy later on, you're going to be reading a new restriction list because they're going to keep updating the list because people keep coming up with stuff. We're just going to keep making rules and do not handle, do not taste, do not touch over and over and over and over again because that is what we do. That is how we solve problems. Do not handle, do not touch, do not taste. Now, in a biblical construct, according to the flesh, guess what Abraham is doing? This is an elemental principle of the world right here. I'm helping God out. You see, that's what the Pharisees were doing. They were trying to help God out. We're going to make this better. If I'm right about Adam, that's what Adam was doing. I'm helping God out. I'm going to make it better. What Abraham's doing. I'm going to make it better. It's what Sarah was doing. I'm going to make it better. It's what the Galatians, the Judaizers in Galatia were doing. We're going to make it better. Problem is, it never works. Because anyone that tries to make it better and better and better will from the flesh reap corruption. Because you know what happens when you keep trying to make it better and you enslave yourself to an elementary principle: do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. Do you know what ends up happening? Oh, it's been 2 months ago, or whenever it was, we talked about this in one of the sessions of this program. Let's say Adam and Eve make it through until Cain and Abel are born. Because they're still in the garden, maybe Cain and Abel don't go down the path they did, but they start growing up. If I'm right, and I think I am, that Adam is the one that said, do not touch. Now, maybe over time, he and Eve have conversations, and he actually says, "Well, he may." But at some point, I don't know for sure it's Adam or if it's Eve. As those boys get to start growing, you know what you're going to do? Same thing you do in the house. Okay, you child-proof your house, right? You just don't tell a kid, "Don't eat those cookies." What you do is you get one of those little locks that goes onto the cabinet door. Click, just to make sure that they don't get into the cabinet where the cookies are found. Now, most of the time, those things work, but every now and again, guess what happens? You forget, or you're gone long enough, or maybe they get a little bit bigger, and they actually have an IQ above room temperature, and they've seen you open and close the lock. And guess what? They figure out how to do. Well, they figure out how to open and close the lock, and you come home one day, and suddenly all your cookies are gone because they found a way to get into the lock. See, I'm assuming Adam would be just like the rest of us. I want to protect my kids from eating something they ought not eat. So I'm not only going to tell them don't you even touch it. I'm going to tell them not even to walk near that tree. But eventually what I'm going to do is I'm going to build me a fence. I'm going to get me a fence around that tree and make sure my boys don't go through that fence. But as they get bigger, I'm going to have to make that fence taller. And eventually it's going to be a wall. Do you know what eventually that wall would be around that tree? Do you know what it would have become? We have a place like it today down in the Middle East. Actually, we got a couple of them down there. One's called Mecca. Another's called the Temple Mount, because that's what we do. You could throw the Vatican in there too if you wanted to, because that's what we do. You start building that wall, and originally that wall was put around there, that fence was put around there with the same reason it said, "Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch." You see, all of that was done to try and make sure we don't violate God's law, but eventually it would devolve into some kind of place of idolatry, a sacred, holy place, the holy lands, the holy tree, because that's what we do with it. That's not depravity. That is not depravity. Sorry, it's just not. What that is an appearance of wisdom, and it leads to ESV, a self-made religion. How's the King James translate that? I was about to quote it. I'm about to get it wrong, I think. The King James translates it. Will worship. Self-made. Worship of the will. That's the elemental principle of the world. The elemental principle of the world is not depravity. It's just not. I was actually working on a sermon. I'm not sure it'll ever get preached. But I was actually working on a sermon. I need to stop. Y'all put some comments in there that I need to go back to. Let me stop. Somebody in about 15 minutes, however long it takes to get through these, ask me about most people. What I want to say about most people. Let me go back there. Some of this, I'm sorry. I promise y'all I'll keep a track of those. What I've seen is where people or elders make laws in the church, like being here on Wednesday night, twice on Sunday. I don't think could be verified by Scripture and make a law out of it. And say you must listen to your elders. Let me see if I can read the rest of it over there. I guess you get what I'm saying. Yeah, we do that kind of stuff. Absolutely. And it is biblically true that there are elders, there are shepherds, pastors in the church that need to be followed. Hebrews 13 verse 17, 1 Peter 5 is there as well, so on. The elders of 1 Timothy 5, elders that rule well are worthy of double honor. Yeah, absolutely. But you're also correct that you go back and you start looking at, and I do see some differing historical records, let's just say, about Sunday night and Wednesday night attendances. Usually they're connected to the war, but there's some different ideas out there as well. But yeah. And then all of a sudden, a Wednesday night 7 o'clock service gets elevated to the same level, the same standing in terms of its structure as coming together on the first day of the week. Okay, the reason we come together on the first day of the week is because the text says so. There's nothing in the text that says you have to come together on the fourth day of the week. So yeah, there's balance in there, but that's exactly what we do. We create all these rules and these expectations because it's part of the elemental principle. Okay. Written on the heart. Good to see you back here. Is it possible the you is the serpent? We cannot eat of it, and neither can you. Well, that goes back a minute. I'm assuming I'm assuming. Oh, I'm sorry. Hold on. Let me put that back for a second. I'm assuming you mean the you here, verse 3. I don't think so. Let me check. I've never checked that. Hold on. Let me see if I can pull that up real quick. According to the little, y'all can't see it, but I have a little pop up when I hover over words in my Bible program. It's kind of neat. It will actually give me a synopsis of the word, the morphology of the word. It's imperfect, second person. It is a plural pronoun though, so it would not be singular to Satan. It is a plural pronoun, so the you would be y'all. So I'm assuming then that would be. Let me go back here. I've never had this thought before. That's a good thought to have. Nope, it's singular. It's the same word. Yep, it's the same word, same pronoun, and it is singular though in the first reference. So it is plural here in the second reference. So I would say I would go written on the heart. I'm gonna go no on that one. I don't know how you get. I don't know how you get over there to Satan. But if somebody with more Hebrew knowledge than I have has a thought, then I'd listen to it. But my native instinct would be to say no. That's got to be talking about Adam and Eve. Okay. Hey, Alabama. We don't know how many times the serpent came to them about that tree. We only know that one of his tries. That's also true. That's also true. There is no enumeration of the events that take place here. I would guess it's the first time, but you're right. How do you know that? You don't. And then you also have to deal with, and as I was talking about it, I did not address it because it's a little bit outside of our scope right here. She also gave some to her husband who was with her. So apparently Adam was there. And take what Paul says about that Eve was deceived and Adam was not. Really, that's First Timothy 2, right? That really makes me think that you shall not touch it came from Adam. Because Eve is going through a period of deception here, and Adam knows exactly what's happening. And if he knows exactly what's going on, he may not have said, do not touch it because he was worried about Eve. He may have said, do not touch it because he was worried about himself. And if that's the case, not only is that an elemental principle of the world, that is also exactly what men do. That is exactly how we would handle that situation. I actually really want that fruit, so I'm gonna say, we ain't doing that. So that would be consistent, but obviously I have no proof of it. So written on says suit and tie, instrumental accompaniment, attendance, and so on and so forth, clapping of hands, and so on. I would have a longer discussion with you about that second one, instrumental accompaniment, because the text does say stuff about the instrument. But with that little caveat, I'm gonna go with you on that one. We've done a bunch of stuff. David asked about free will. I don't remember what I was saying when you said it, but exactly, I'm not sure what I missed that one, David. I'm sorry. I don't know what I was talking about when you said that. Let's see what we got. Is that Runger? Burger. Burger Sleuth. Jesus is the truth. Hell is real. We all sin. He died on the cross. We have everything. Put faith. Put faith in him alone to save you. Trust in what he did for you. And okay. All of that's there. You good? Okay. Burger, appreciate that. Oh, well, hold on. Asceticism is the rigorous treating of the body more like I am holy if I sleep on a 1 minute a 1 inch mattress. That would be the asceticism of Galatians or Colossians chapter 2. Yep. Burger Sleuth adds in there, Jesus saves, our works don't. I know why you say that, Burger Sleuth, but you walked into the wrong you walked into the wrong class here to have that being supported by you. Because the text doesn't say that. In fact, the text says just the opposite. Okay. Because before Hebrews 11:6 pops up, without faith it is impossible to please him. That's true. Which I assume is what you meant back up here in the previous comment about faith alone in Jesus. That's true. Faith is absolutely essential. Anybody who denies the essentiality of faith is absolutely denying the text. Absolutely. Strangely, though, in chapter 5 of the very same book, he became perfect, became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him. See, that's a work. That's a series of works. That does not say you don't need to work. That says you need to obey. In fact, Jesus himself, in talking about who would be saved, says, be faithful unto death. Faithfulness. Those are works. Can't be faithful without working. I will give you a crown of life. See, that's conditional. That's subjunctive. Meaning, if you are not faithful unto death, guess what I'll do? Well, if you are not faithful unto death, I will come and remove your lampstand from its place unless you repent. Oh, repentance is a work. The idea that works are not essential to your salvation is just not biblical. Just not. Okay? The New Testament has a list of at least 27 things. 27 things, at the very least, that save you. None of them are alone. Not a single one of them is alone. There's 27 of them, minimum. Okay? Evangelical doctrine is just false here. And it has created a dichotomy that is absolutely wrong. Okay? Go back to the very beginning. Okay? What we've been talking about here at length. Here's a work. Here's a very simple work. Well, actually, there's two works here. Let me go back up to chapter 2. There's two works here. He has to work it and he has to keep it. Okay, if Adam had just sat on his butt all day, that would have been a sin. And he has to not do something, which is also a work. He has to not eat. Okay? See, that's works. But wait a minute. Was this true? Without faith, it was impossible to please God. Is impossible to please him? Was that true in the garden? Because then Adam and Eve needed faith, which is exactly what Eve needed, and she didn't have it because she was deceived. Because in the garden, faith and works go together. Because they do. James is right. Faith is dead without works. Faith is completed by works. So the idea that you're saved without working is just completely wrong. Yes, you're saved by faith. Hundreds of verses say you're saved by faith. Similar number of verses say you're saved by repentance, saved by confession, saved by baptism, saved by faithfulness, saved by obedience, saved by doing the will of the Father. It's all over the Bible. Saved by hope, saved by grace, saved by mercy. It's all over the Bible. You create a doctrine that says you're saved by anything alone. It's just wrong. God didn't even say that. Find me the verse that says you're saved by faith alone. I'll wait. Actually, I won't. I'm going to keep going because it doesn't exist. Every verse that you would say that you are saved by faith alone does not have the word alone or only in it. You have to add it to every single verse that says you are saved by faith. And then you have to deny, like 1 Peter 3:21, baptism doth also now save us. You have to deny that because it says you're saved by baptism. You have to deny that on some level. Okay? Even Romans chapter 10. Romans 10, 9 and 10. Okay? For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. Guess what? Confessing, that's a work. Comes out of right here. That's a work. You have to take the first half of the verse. For with the heart one believes only and is justified. And then since he has already believed, he will now, by imputed righteousness, overcoming his depraved nature, he will actually now confess and be saved. But he was already saved before he confessed. Because he confesses only because the Holy Spirit is now in him, regenerating and renewing him to cause him to be saved. So that precedes his belief. And it also precedes and empowers his confession. So you have to break this apart. I got a great idea. Guess what? You better believe in Jesus, and guess what you also must do? You better confess him. How about we do both of those? Ta-da! Now we believe what the verse says. Because without faith, you can't believe him. And if you deny Jesus, if you will not confess him, Matthew chapter 10, he will deny you. Don't make it hard. They all teach the same thing. Got to move on. All right. Back to the other talking. Wouldn't adding to be the first sin then? I've had that thought too written, and that's a great. If I were going to argue against everything I've said, you just brought it up. Okay, well, however long ago this was in terms of the comments, you just brought it up. Because is adding to be the first sin then? That's a great question. I don't really have a great answer for it. I will say this, though. The Bible. Who's the first sinner in the Bible? Who does the Bible say is the first sin? Well, the Bible says the first sin is, just go to Romans 5 here. Which verse do you want? I've got too many highlights there. I can't find it. Where is it? There. Death reigned from sin to Adam. There it is. Where? I need the word similitude. Even those who were sinning was not like the transgression of. Sorry. Let me bring my King James up here, because I'm pretty sure the King James has similitude there. That's the word I was looking for, and I couldn't find it. There it is. After the similitude of Adam's transgression. Translation's got my brain there. I couldn't find it. Similitude of Adam's transgression. Well, who was actually the first person to sin? In terms of what we have recorded in the text, the first person to sin was Eve. The text never attribute. Now, again, to go to 1 Timothy 2, I hadn't brought this up yet, so let me go ahead to 1 Timothy 2. I hope I'm right about this. It's got to be Timothy 2 where he does it. It's not, for Adam was first formed in Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived. But the woman being deceived was in the transgression. Okay? So Adam was not deceived, Eve was. But in terms of the chronology of the events, Eve sinned first, but it's never attributed to her. The fault is always laid at the feet of Adam. So if I wanted to answer what you're saying right there, that this is a singular transgression. I think it is. Is it actually singular? Let me verify that it is. I think it is. Yeah, it is an actual singular thing. But yeah, you could not only make the case that adding to would be sinful, you could make the case that if the text is actually stating it, if there's no gap, let's assume, let me go back to the ESV for a second. If there is no gap between, by gap I mean time gap, where she takes of the fruit and eats it and gives some to her husband who was with her, he's not deceived and he's standing there. If with her means that she didn't have to go find him in the garden, that he was with her, she may have eaten first, but he wasn't deceived, which means he was looking right at that. And if he was actually with her, if there's no chronological gap, that's my point. If that text simply means what it says, that with her actually means that during this entire process, he was with her, which would make a whole lot of sense, because if he's off on the other side of the garden, keeping it and tending it, and this is not an addition to God's law, he did not make that specification. If he's over there and has no knowledge of these events taking over here, it's real hard to make him be the one who's at first fault for the sin. But the text never faults. Faults her for being deceived, but the text never faults Eve. Every New Testament reference beyond that is to Adam. So where do you start the process here? So that's how I would respond to it. But that is for everything I've been saying for the last hour and a half. There's your best argument against what I've been saying, other than perhaps simply to state that that what Eve is the record of God having said, "Do not touch," which again is possible. Maybe God does repeat it, and when he does repeat it, he adds to that, which to my response to that be the one I made earlier. That seems awfully unfair up here. Either that or he changed his law. When he added Eve, he himself added to his law, which he is God. He can do that if he wants to. But see, that's an awfully, that seems a bit worked to me, convenient to me. Okay. I would rather state that Adam adds the do not touch it, because as I said earlier, he actually wanted the fruit. And there is the origin of the sin. And in order to stop his indulgence of the flesh, he adds the rule. Maybe he added it to himself before he ever added it to Eve. But then when the moment hit, his addition to the law didn't stop the indulgences of the flesh, because it was of no value, because what was actually the problem was his spirit. His heart was wrong. See, I would not separate this into 17 different actions. I would say this is a singular transaction. When I conceive of it, that's what I have here. Adam and Eve are together on this, or they're together, and Eve in her innocence is deceived, and the actual origin of the sin, which in the biblical text, as far as I can tell, is always attributed to Adam. The actual sin began in Adam, not Eve. Adam's problem was not deception. His was a spirit problem. His was a heart problem. Okay? That's where we need to get to Thursday, because we've been talking about something done according to the flesh. The answer to this is to do things according to the spirit. Okay? Now, I need to start wrapping up. But according to the flesh is not about depravity. That's the point. Okay? Even, by the way, even if I am wrong here and God did actually say that, doesn't change anything about the influx of this preceding depravity. It doesn't change anything in terms of the argument. But if according to the flesh precedes depravity, then does according to the Spirit. What's that connection? So that's Thursday's class. We need to revisit, let me say it that way, excuse me. We need to revisit our discussion of what it means to be according to the Spirit. Okay, so that's where we'll be on Thursday. I got to keep going down here. Written says, neither shall you touch it, the you being the serpent. Oh, the second you. Oh, okay, you may put that in later. Neither shall you touch it. No. All of the pronouns, as far as I can tell, they're the same. They're masculine plural pronouns. All of the yous in this section are masculine plural pronouns, but they are plural, would be the point. And if Eve was directly saying that to the serpent, that would need to be a singular, unless she's just inclusive of the serpent. And Satan's response is also in the plural. But the serpent said to the woman, y'all will not die. It's in the plural. Yep. These are all plural all the way through it. Anyway, that's good thoughts, though, Written. That's you're making me think about something I never thought about before. Appreciate it. What Tammy say here? I don't think that at least our congregation that Sunday night or Wednesday either, but only encouraged. And by the way, for those who don't know, Tammy is one of the members here at Rockledge. Frankly, Tammy's actually the wife of one of our elders here at the Rockledge congregation. So, but she's right about that. Now, the Rockledge Church does a really good job in trying to keep a good emphasis on those kind of things. So yeah, absolutely, Tammy. Would love to about we talk about that some other day, man. I need to keep going. We could talk about it someday though. Hey saying, so Adam threw Eve under the bus. I've heard preachers make too much about this point, or at least more than I'm confident about saying it. That Adam, to Adam who was with her, I've heard entire sermons kind of emphasizing that right there. And it's not that I certainly disagreed with the sermons. Sermons were good sermons. But I don't know that because I don't know exactly what does with her mean that he was with her, or just she gave it to him with her, meaning I've eaten it, you need to eat it too now. Which, by the way, you women can talk us men into a lot of stuff. Absolutely. And she was standing there naked. That helps too. Y'all win most of the arguments like that. Okay. So yeah. And she had just eaten the fruit. So I don't know what that might have meant in terms of that's another topic for another day. But the sense that makes the process that makes the most sense to me, or the understanding that makes the most sense to me, is again, if he is not engaged in this, Okay, if he is not a full participant in this, other than maybe to make the case that he is to be the head of his wife, Ephesians 5, 1 Corinthians 11, all that kind of stuff. Other than to make that case that he was absent when Eve was going through this process, and so that is the sin, a departure from his male spiritual leadership role. See, I don't think that's what the text is doing. The text, be it, I went to Romans 5 earlier, that works. Be it 1 Corinthians 15. I mean, 1 Corinthians 15 might even be stronger than Romans 5, although they're about the same. Yeah, they're about the same. But 1 Corinthians 5 or 1 Corinthians 15 on the same topic. Eve never takes the initial blame. So at some point, in some manner, you've got to throw Adam under the bus here too. And again, I cannot definitively prove this. I cannot. Okay? But the thing that makes the most sense to me is that Genesis 2 gives us the exact record of what God's law was. That Adam was, quote unquote, with her and not deceived. If that is true, if point A is true, Genesis 2 gives us the law, and point C is true, that he's not deceived and he's part of the process. The point B, the one in between those two things, the do not touch it, came from him. But now that he's hearing Satan is not deceived, and he sees his woman looking over there going, you know, that could be good. He's like, okay, we can play that game. So between the serpent and Eve, Adam went right past the law that he added and jumped into it. Like I said, I cannot prove all of that. But it's the construct that makes the most sense expositionally through this section, and then allows a path to properly blame Adam, or to blame Adam properly in the New Testament. Yes, I just corrected the split infinitive. That's why I repeated that sentence. That's what I did in my brain. But that's what makes the most sense to me. Okay? Take it for what it's worth. I could be wrong. All right, Tammy, I see you there. I want to talk about this for a minute. That lesson that I was working on that may never turn into a sermon about most people. If every version, in whole or in part, about depravity or original sin is correct, then most people aren't depraved. Every person is depraved. Every person. Okay? Now, if you happen to be a Calvinist and you believe in some version of the doctrine of depravity, what you tend to do is you tend to look around at all of the depraved things that happen in this world. Okay? And it's gotten worse. In terms of the reports coming, they've gotten worse. Guess what actually hasn't gotten worse? What we do to each other. I mean, even Israel was guilty of burning their children to Molech, human sacrifice. Okay, we have our own versions of it, but it's not worse than Molech was a bull-like creature with, I believe, the forearms were stretched out, and that's what you did. You laid your child, if I remember the renderings of it that I've seen. That's basically what you did. Okay, we do a lot of bad stuff to kids here too, but not worse than that. Okay, but back in the days of Moloch, did most people burn their children to Moloch? No, they didn't. Most people didn't do that. Now, if you're alive during, say, the time of Elijah, and you see your nation is depraved, it's going bad, right? You effectively look to God and say, here I am alone, until God looks back at you and says, no, you're not. I got 7,000 people that I'm going to seal up. And then more than that, actually. Okay, just yesterday. Was it yesterday? I think both were yesterday. After a concert, was it in Chicago? A group of, let's just call them young men, I think primarily, turned and started beating on people. There was a guy, was this yesterday or 2 days ago, that went into a Walmart with a knife and started stabbing people until a man with a gun showed up. And then yesterday, a man with a gun walked up onto the 33rd floor, if I'm not mistaken, of a building. See, we hear all of those stories and we think depravity. Look how bad the world is, and so on and so forth. Guess what most people did? Well, most people went to the concert and went home. Most people, it was a Walmart, right? Most people that day walked into the Walmart. And a larger number of most people tried to stop the dude with the knife, then took a knife. Most people of the millions that live in New York City didn't carry a firearm into a building and shoot people. Most people just went to work. That's what most people do. When you drive down the interstate, I drive down I-95, going back and forth to the church in my house now. Hundreds of cars every day. Guess what? Most people, although they have very bad lane discipline and they camp in the middle and left-hand lanes, which you shouldn't. Another topic for another day. But most people drive up and down the road perfectly fine. Most people do it. Every now and again you come across the nut. But most people drive in a way that doesn't cause wrecks. Most people do that. Most people. Most people in your neighborhood don't tear down your house, don't break into it and steal anything. Most people. When my house got flooded in Hurricane Harvey, guess what most people did? Well, you could say most people did nothing because they had their own stuff and they didn't do anything. But guess what happened the day after my house flooded? As soon as the waters went down, because every house in my neighborhood flooded, guess what was up and down the streets? Oh, there were a few people there trying to find ways of making some money. Boy, there were some scam artists there doing some things to houses and trying to raise money to help clean this, and their fees were exorbitant. But you know what most people did? They showed up. Some churches, some Boy and Girl Scout things, just some people. Most people showed up and they walked up and down the street bringing I had people in my house that I'd never seen before, never see again. And they were helping tear down the drywall and pull stuff out and build it up. And I said, thank you. That's what most people did. And 100,000 plus houses flooded in Houston. That's what most people did. Because that's what most people do. You see, the doctrines of depravity and everything you believe connected to them can't be true. Because throughout all of human history, that is not what most people do. If your doctrine about according to the flesh and according to the spirit is based upon not just most people, but every person suffering from the outfall of original sin or depravity, you got some splaining to do. Lucy, you got some splaining to do. Because that's not how most people live. It's just not. Your doctrine needs to explain how all of these lost, unelected, non-elected, non-called sinners, how most people pay their taxes, how most people don't kill other people, how most people help out the homeless, how most people give charitable contributions, how most people. I was in a Circle K the other day. Circle K is where I go and get my office drink every day. Best deal in town, under $1 for a 42-ounce cup. Do it every day. Every day I'm at the office, I got one of these cups over here. When I'm drinking out of my little cup here that says Alabama, what's inside of it, I actually pour out of my Circle K cup because I don't want y'all looking at my big Circle K cup. I'd rather you see, because this looks like I might actually be doing something less bad than this. But that's what's in here. But 2 days ago, no, last week, I was in the Circle K and just said hello to the gentleman in front of me. We were just having a nice little conversation. And he saw that this was the only thing in my hand. And he said, "Is that all you're buying?" And I said, "Yeah." And so as he was paying cash, as he took cash back from the cashier, he took out $1 because she had a few it was $1.06 after tax. He said, "Pay for him." And I said, "Thank you." And then, well, I got to the door first. And when I got to the door, I held the door open for him because he was carrying a couple things through, because that's what most people do. I didn't invited him to church because anyway, but that's how most people live. Depravity doesn't work as a doctrine because it's simply not true. Most people aren't depraved. Do you know what they are? They're made of flesh and they're made of spirit. They're made in the image of God. That's most people. All right. Tammy, don't tell anybody. If and when that becomes my sermon, don't tell anybody you just heard the sermon and that I did it in like 7 minutes. Okay? Because it's going to be 35 minutes long when I do it. So, but there you go, Tammy. But that is what we're going to be talking about on some level Thursday. Because we've talked about according to the flesh now for 2 shows. We need at least 1 show on according to the spirit. Okay? So that's where we'll pick up then, Lord willing, on Thursday. Okay? What you got there, Ridden? Hold on. What is that? Oh, you got the drink. You got the cup. There you go, man. That's even almost the right color. Hey, that's pretty good, man. Appreciate it. All right. I do appreciate the comments. Appreciate y'all's participation. Probably should have gotten some of those comments earlier, but at least I got back to them mostly. So anyway, we will stop it right there. Lord willing, I'll see you back here on Thursday. And as always, it is my prayer that you will go out and make your day a great one for God. Have a good day, everybody.